The morning darkness wrapped around Jasmine Williams like a cold blanket as she stepped out of her family's small apartment. At 12 years old, she already carried the weight of responsibilities far beyond her years. The worn-out backpack on her shoulders, a hand-me-down from her younger brother before he moved away to live with their aunt, held her precious schoolbooks and a simple lunch of peanut butter sandwich. Detroit's east side was just beginning to wake up. Streetlights cast long shadows on the cracked sidewalks as Jasmine began her daily 3-mile journey to school. The October wind cut through her thin jacket, making her pull it tighter around her small frame. She had grown 2 inches since last winter, and the jacket's sleeves now stopped well above her wrists. Her mother, Teresa Williams, worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. The morning shift at the local diner started at 6 a.m., and the evening job at the grocery store didn't end until 10 p.m. Jasmine understood why her mother couldn't drive her to school. They couldn't afford a car, and the bus route had been cut from their neighborhood last year due to budget issues. As she walked past the abandoned buildings and empty lots, Jasmine kept her head high. Her mother always told her, "We might not have much, but we have our dignity." She watched other kids getting dropped off in warm cars, their parents kissing them goodbye, their new backpacks filled with fresh supplies. But Jasmine never let jealousy take root in her heart. Instead, she focused on her dreams. The sound of her shoes scraping against the pavement echoed in the quiet morning. The left one had a hole developing near the toe, and she had stuffed it with newspaper to keep her sock from getting wet. Jasmine had learned many such tricks over the years, like wearing 2 pairs of socks when it was cold, or using plastic bags inside her shoes when it rained. At the halfway point of her journey, Jasmine passed Mrs. Johnson's corner store. The elderly woman was already setting up for the day, and she always waved at Jasmine through the window. Sometimes, on particularly cold mornings, Mrs. Johnson would call her in and give her a hot chocolate. But Jasmine couldn't stop today. She had a math test first period, and she wanted to review her notes one more time before class. The neighborhood changed as she got closer to school. The houses became bigger, the lawns better maintained, and the cars parked in driveways newer and shinier. Jasmine noticed these differences but didn't let them define her world. Her mother had taught her that education was the key to a better future, and she took that lesson seriously. Other students started appearing on the sidewalks, most walking in groups, laughing and talking about television shows Jasmine had never seen. She heard snippets of conversations about new phones, weekend plans at the mall, and upcoming birthday parties. While they carried the latest trendy backpacks and more fashionable clothes, Jasmine's outfit came from the donation box at church. Despite everything, Jasmine maintained good grades. She studied by candlelight when the electricity was cut off, did her homework during lunch breaks, and borrowed textbooks from the library when she couldn't afford to buy them. Her teachers noticed her dedication, even if they didn't know the full extent of her struggles. As she approached Benjamin Franklin Middle School, Jasmine took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. The grand brick building stood before her, its American flag waving in the morning breeze. She was 15 minutes early, as usual. This gave her time to wash her face in the bathroom, smooth down her hair, and prepare for the day ahead. Walking up the steps, Jasmine allowed herself a small smile. She had made it another morning, and she was ready to learn. What she didn't know was that someone had been watching her daily journey, someone whose act of kindness would soon change her life forever. But for now, she was just another student starting another school day, carrying dreams bigger than her worn-out backpack could hold, and hope stronger than the cold morning air that followed her through the school doors. Officer Sarah Chen sat in her police cruiser, sipping her morning coffee while watching the quiet streets of Detroit's east side come to life. At 32, she had spent 5 years patrolling these same streets, learning every corner, every face, and every story that made up this struggling neighborhood. But lately, one particular story had caught her attention. Every morning, like clockwork, she watched a young black girl walk past her usual observation point. The girl always walked alone, her thin jacket pulled tight around her body, carrying a backpack that had seen better days. Officer Chen had first noticed her 3 weeks ago, and something about the child's determined walk touched her heart. Today, parked near Mrs. Johnson's corner store, Officer Chen checked her watch. It was 7:15 a.m., right on time. The girl appeared, walking with that same purposeful stride. Through her years on the force, Chen had developed a keen eye for details. She noticed how the girl's shoes were wearing thin, how she sometimes stopped to adjust the newspaper stuffed inside them, and how she never complained despite the obvious discomfort. The sight stirred memories of Officer Chen's own childhood. As the daughter of Chinese immigrants, she remembered the years when her parents worked multiple jobs, the times when new shoes were a luxury they couldn't afford, and the long walks to school because they couldn't afford bus fare. Perhaps that's why this girl's daily journey resonated so deeply with her. While watching through her windshield, Officer Chen pulled out her small notebook. She had already written down several observations. Arrives at corner of Maple and 4th at 7:15 a.m., heading to Franklin Middle School. Always alone. No winter coat. Today, she added another note. Limping slightly, shoes getting worse. Other officers sometimes teased Chen about her detailed note-taking, but she believed that understanding her community meant paying attention to the small things. Through her window, she watched as Mrs. Johnson, the store owner, waved at the girl. The child smiled and waved back, but didn't stop today. Officer Chen made another note. Known to Mrs. Johnson, possible community connection. As she followed the girl's progress from a distance in her patrol car, Chen noticed how other students began appearing on the streets, walking in groups, carrying newer backpacks, wearing warm winter clothes. The contrast was striking. Yet the girl never changed her pace or hung her head. She walked with dignity, something Officer Chen deeply respected. During her morning patrols, Chen had learned more about the neighborhood. She knew about the canceled bus routes, the struggling single-parent families, and the widening gap between this area and the more affluent sections near the school. Each day, she watched this young girl bridge that gap on foot, crossing between two very different worlds. Officer Chen switched off her car's engine and stepped out, deciding to talk with Mrs. Johnson. The bell above the store door chimed as she entered. Mrs. Johnson looked up from her cash register and smiled warmly. "Good morning, Officer Chen. Hear about our young friend." "You know the girl who just passed by?" Chen asked, though she had already guessed the answer. "That's Jasmine Williams," Mrs. Johnson replied, her voice filled with concern. "Lives with her mama about 3 miles from here. Good girl, always polite. Sometimes I give her hot chocolate on cold mornings, but she's usually in a hurry to get to school. Her mother works 2 jobs, you know." Chen nodded, adding these details to her notebook. Something needed to be done. Or what? Police officers were supposed to protect and serve their community, but sometimes that meant more than just enforcing laws. Sometimes it meant seeing the quiet struggles and finding ways to help. Back in her cruiser, Officer Chen watched as dark clouds gathered overhead. The weather forecast had predicted rain, possibly turning to sleet by afternoon. She thought about Jasmine walking 3 miles home in that weather, wearing those worn-out shoes. Her hand tightened on the steering wheel as she made a decision. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would do more than just watch. Little did Officer Chen know that her decision would not only change Jasmine's life, but would also start a chain of events that would transform their entire community. For now, though, she simply wrote one more note in her book. Plan of action needed, tomorrow. December arrived in Detroit with a brutal cold snap that sent temperatures plunging to 15 degrees. On this particular morning, the bitter wind cut through the streets like sharp knives, making even the shortest walks painful. For Jasmine Williams, this morning would prove to be her toughest challenge yet. She woke up to find their apartment colder than usual. The heating system had broken down again, and her mother had already left for her morning shift at the diner. Jasmine's hands shook as she got dressed, putting on every layer she owned: 2 pairs of socks, her only pair of jeans, 3 t-shirts, and her thin jacket. But it wasn't enough to fight against the fierce December cold. The real problem, though, was her shoes. The duct tape she had carefully wrapped around them yesterday was already peeling off, unable to stick in the extreme cold. The newspaper stuffed inside was damp from yesterday's snow, making her feet feel like blocks of ice. Still, she had no choice. School attendance was important to her, and she had perfect attendance so far this year. As Jasmine stepped outside, the wind nearly knocked her over. The temperature display on the bank across the street flashed 15 degrees Fahrenheit in bright red numbers. Her eyes watered immediately, the tears freezing on her cheeks. Each step was harder than the last, her feet already numbed despite her double layers of socks. 1 mile into her walk, disaster struck. The sole of her right shoe finally gave up its fight to stay attached, flapping open with every step. The icy slush on the ground seeped directly into her sock. Jasmine tried to fix it, her fingers trembling as she attempted to wrap the loose duct tape tighter, but the tape had lost all its stickiness in the cold. She stood there, trembling, fighting back tears that threatened to freeze on her face. For the first time in months, she considered turning back. But the thought of disappointing her mother, who worked so hard to give her an education, kept her moving forward. Each step became a battle: lift foot, drag foot, wince, repeat. Near Mrs. Johnson's store, Jasmine had to stop. Her feet were so numb she could barely feel them, and the pain in her toes had become unbearable. She leaned against a wall, trying to catch her breath. Her school books felt heavier than ever in her old backpack, and her shoulders ached from hunching against the wind. Mrs. Johnson, setting up her store as usual, saw Jasmine through the window. The elderly woman rushed outside, shock evident on her face. "Child, you can't walk in this weather. Not in those shoes." She tried to convince Jasmine to come inside and wait while she called someone, but Jasmine shook her head. She couldn't miss school. She couldn't let her mother down. With determination born of desperation, Jasmine pushed herself off the wall and continued her journey. Her walk had become a noticeable limp now, each step sending shooting pains up her legs. The wind seemed to blow straight through her jacket, and her fingers had lost all feeling despite being tucked into her sleeves. Other students drove past in warm cars, their windows foggy from the heaters running at full blast. Some didn't even notice her, while others stared with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Jasmine kept her eyes fixed on the ground, focusing on just making it to the next block, then the next, then the next. 2 blocks from school, Jasmine could no longer hold back her tears. They froze almost instantly on her cheeks, but she couldn't stop them from falling. Her right foot was soaked through, and she could barely feel her left. The cold had seeped into her bones, making every movement a struggle. What Jasmine didn't know was that she wasn't alone in her struggle this morning. Officer Sarah Chen, who had been following her progress from a distance, watched as the young girl fought against both the elements and her circumstances. The sight of Jasmine limping, her shoe practically destroyed, the thin jacket providing almost no protection, became the final straw. As Jasmine took another painful step, Officer Chen made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She couldn't stand by and watch any longer. This morning would be the breaking point, not just of Jasmine's shoes, but of the barrier between a caring police officer and a child in need. The time for just observing was over. The time for action had come. Officer Sarah Chen turned on her patrol car's lights and slowly pulled up beside Jasmine, who immediately tensed at the sight of the police vehicle. The young girl's shoulders hunched even more, though she tried to stand straight despite her trembling legs and frozen feet. "Good morning," Officer Chen called out softly, rolling down her window. The warm air from her car's heater escaped into the frigid morning. "Would you like a ride to school?" She kept her voice gentle, recognizing the fear and uncertainty in Jasmine's eyes. After all, in this neighborhood, many children had learned to be wary of police officers. Jasmine stood still, her wet shoes leaving small puddles on the icy sidewalk. She looked at the police car, then down the long road ahead, calculating how much longer she would have to walk in the bitter cold. Her mother had always warned her never to get into cars with strangers, but this was a police officer. Still, she hesitated. "I'm Officer Chen," the police officer continued, noticing Jasmine's internal struggle. "I've seen you walking this route every morning. You're heading to Franklin Middle School, right?" She turned the heater up higher, letting its warmth reach out to where Jasmine stood shivering. "Yes, ma'am," Jasmine replied quietly, her voice barely audible above the wind. She shifted her weight, wincing as pain shot through her frozen feet. Officer Chen stepped out of her car, and Jasmine noticed she wasn't much taller than herself. The officer's kind face and gentle smile helped ease some of her fears. "I promise it's okay. It's too cold to walk, especially with your shoes in that condition. Please, let me help you." Something in Officer Chen's voice reminded Jasmine of her mother, that same tone of genuine concern. After another moment's hesitation, she nodded slowly. Officer Chen opened the passenger door, and Jasmine carefully climbed in, immediately enveloped by the blessed warmth of the heater. As they drove, Officer Chen shared stories about her own childhood, breaking the awkward silence. "You know, When I was your age, I used to walk to school too, she said, making a careful turn onto Madison Avenue. My parents were immigrants from China, and we couldn't afford a car. Sometimes I had to wear 2 jackets because we couldn't buy a winter coat. Jasmine's eyes widened with surprise. She looked at Officer Chen more closely now, seeing beyond the uniform. Really? Did you have to stuff newspaper in your shoes too? Officer Chen laughed softly. Old Chinese newspapers. My father would save them just for that purpose. We had to be creative to stay warm. She glanced at Jasmine's worn-out shoes. Those newspapers don't work so well when they get wet, though, do they? No, Jasmine admitted, feeling more comfortable now. Especially not today. The duct tape didn't help either. She found herself sharing more about her daily walk, her mother's 2 jobs, and their struggle to make ends meet. Officer Chen listened attentively, occasionally nodding in understanding. You know what I admire about you, Jasmine? Your determination. I've watched you walk past my patrol spot every morning, never complaining, always pushing forward. That reminds me of my mother. As they neared the school, Jasmine felt warmth that wasn't just from the car's heater. Nobody had ever told her they admired her before. I want to be a doctor someday, she confided suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. A doctor? Officer Chen's eyes lit up. That's a wonderful goal. Do you like science classes? They're my favorite, Jasmine replied, her usual shyness melting away. I got an A on my last biology test, even though I had to study by candlelight because our electricity was out. The police car pulled up in front of Franklin Middle School, but Officer Chen wasn't ready to end their conversation. She turned to face Jasmine fully. Listen, I have an idea. Would it be okay if I gave you a ride to school on very cold mornings? And maybe we could talk more about your dreams of becoming a doctor. Jasmine's face brightened with hope, but then doubt crept in. You wouldn't mind? I don't want to be a bother. You're not a bother at all, Officer Chen assured her firmly. Sometimes people need a little help along the way. I know I did when I was your age. Someone helped me then, and now it's my turn to help someone else. As Jasmine stepped out of the warm car, she felt different. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone in her daily struggle. She had found an unexpected friend in a police uniform, someone who understood her challenges because she had lived them too. What neither of them knew then was that this car ride was just the beginning. A simple act of kindness on a freezing December morning would grow into something much bigger than either of them could imagine. That evening, after her shift ended, Officer Sarah Chen couldn't stop thinking about Jasmine. She sat at her desk in the precinct, making phone calls to local businesses and fellow officers. Her partner, Officer Mike Roberts, noticed her staying late and walked over to her desk. What's got you so busy, Chen? He asked, seeing the growing list of notes on her desk. Remember that girl I told you about, the one who walks 3 miles to school? Chen looked up from her phone. I gave her a ride today. Mike, her shoes were completely falling apart. She's been walking in this weather with newspapers stuffed in them. Officer Roberts sat down, listening as Chen explained her plan. Within an hour, several other officers had gathered around her desk, each one offering to help. Officer Johnson knew a manager at Foot Locker. Officer Martinez's wife worked at Burlington Coat Factory. Sergeant Williams had connections with the local community center. The next morning, Chen arrived at the precinct early. Her patrol car's trunk was filled with donations she'd collected the night before. New winter boots, a warm coat, gloves, and school supplies. But she knew this wasn't enough. She wanted to do more than just provide temporary help. During her lunch break, Chen visited Franklin Middle School and met with Jasmine's teachers. She learned that despite all her challenges, Jasmine maintained excellent grades. Her science teacher, Mrs. Peterson, mentioned that Jasmine often stayed late after school to use the library since they didn't have reliable electricity at home. She has real potential, Mrs. Peterson said, showing Chen some of Jasmine's work, but she needs support to reach it. Sometimes she falls asleep in class because she walks so far in the morning. Chen took notes, just like she did on patrol. But these weren't notes about crimes or suspicious activities. These were notes about a young girl's dreams and the obstacles standing in her way. That afternoon, she submitted paperwork to start a mentoring program at the precinct. When her shift ended, instead of going home, Chen drove to the small apartment complex where Jasmine lived. She had called ahead and arranged to meet with Teresa Williams, Jasmine's mother. The apartment was clean but sparse, with mismatched furniture and bare walls. Despite their obvious poverty, there was pride in how everything was carefully maintained. Teresa Williams sat across from Officer Chen, her work uniform still on from her diner shift, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. At first, she seemed worried about why a police officer wanted to meet with her, but as Chen explained her intentions, tears began forming in Teresa's eyes. "I try so hard," Teresa said softly, "but sometimes it feels like I'm failing her. Working 2 jobs means I can't be there when she needs me. I can't even buy her proper winter clothes." "You're not failing her," Chen assured her firmly. "You're showing her what strength looks like. But everyone needs help sometimes. Let me and my fellow officers be part of your support system." Over the next few hours, they worked out a plan. Chen would pick up Jasmine for school on cold mornings. The precinct's new mentoring program would provide after-school tutoring and a quiet place to study. Local businesses had agreed to donate clothes and supplies, and Chen would help Teresa apply for better job opportunities through their community outreach program. As Chen left the apartment that evening, she saw Jasmine sitting on the steps, doing homework under the dim porch light. The girl looked up and smiled, a real, bright smile that reminded Chen why she had become a police officer in the first place. "Officer Chen," Jasmine called out. "Mom told me you're going to help me study. Is it true?" Chen sat down beside her on the steps. "That's right. And not just me. A lot of people want to help you achieve your dreams. But you have to promise me something." "What's that?" Jasmine asked eagerly. "Promise me you'll keep working hard, keep believing in yourself, and never give up, no matter how tough things get." Jasmine's face grew serious. "I promise. And thank you for seeing me." Those words stuck with Chen as she drove home that night. Thank you for seeing me. So many people had walked past Jasmine, driven past her, without really seeing her. But sometimes, all it takes is one person to really look, really see, and decide to make a difference. The next day, Chen would start implementing her plans, not knowing that her actions would inspire a movement much bigger than herself. But for now, she was simply a police officer who had chosen to look beyond her badge and see the humanity in her community. News of Officer Chen's efforts spread through Detroit's east side like a warm spring breeze. It started small, just whispers at first. Parents at Franklin Middle School talked about the police officer who drove a student to school. Shop owners discussed how she had asked them to help local children. Other officers began sharing stories about Chen's new mentoring program. One cold Friday morning, something unusual happened at the police precinct. Officer Mike Roberts was starting his shift when he noticed a young boy walking to school with a torn backpack. Instead of driving past, he remembered Chen's example. He pulled over and offered the boy a ride, just as Chen had done for Jasmine. "You know," Roberts told the boy during their drive, "I used to think being a police officer was just about catching bad guys. But my partner taught me it's really about helping people." He found himself wanting to do more, just like Chen had. At the local coffee shop, Mrs. Johnson from the corner store was talking with other business owners. "That Officer Chen, she's different," she said, stirring her coffee. "She showed us that we can all do something to help these kids." By the end of their meeting, 6 businesses had agreed to start a small scholarship fund for local students. The changes became more visible with each passing week. Officer Martinez started teaching free self-defense classes for teenage girls at the community center. Sergeant Williams organized a weekend homework club where officers helped students with their studies. Even the grumpy owner of Joe's Diner, where Jasmine's mother worked, began offering free hot meals to children who showed their report cards with improved grades. Local news stations caught wind of the story. They came to film a piece about Officer Chen and Jasmine, but what they found was much bigger. They discovered a community being transformed by a chain reaction of kindness. The reporter interviewed Officer Chen in front of the precinct. "I just did what any person should do," Chen said modestly. "I saw someone who needed help and reached out. What's amazing is how everyone else joined in." The story aired on evening news, and something unexpected happened. Police departments from other parts of Detroit called, wanting to know more about Chen's mentoring program. They wanted to start similar initiatives in their precincts. The idea began spreading to other cities. One morning, Jasmine walked into her school and found something different. The principal was installing a new study room, complete with computers and bright lights. It had been donated by a local tech company that had heard about Chen's efforts. "This is for all students who need a quiet place to study," the principal announced. "Sometimes it takes one story to open many hearts." More changes followed. The city council, impressed by the community's efforts, restored the canceled bus route. Local college students started a tutoring program, inspired by hearing about Jasmine's dreams of becoming a doctor. A dental office began offering free checkups to children from low-income families. Teresa Williams, Jasmine's mother, found herself surrounded by new opportunities too. The owner of a better-paying restaurant had heard her story and offered her a manager position with regular hours. This meant she could spend more time with Jasmine and only needed one job instead of two. Officer Chen watched all of this unfold with quiet amazement. During her morning patrols, she now saw other police officers stopping to chat with children, helping elderly residents carry groceries, and becoming real parts of the community. The barrier between police and residents was slowly breaking down. At a community meeting, an elderly man stood up to speak. "For years, we saw police cars drive past our problems," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "Now we see them stopping to help." Officer Chen didn't just help one girl. She showed us what community really means. The precinct's walls, once bare except for wanted posters and safety notices, now displayed children's artwork and thank you letters. Officers started keeping spare school supplies in their patrol cars. Local shops put up signs reading "Students Welcome" and "Study Space Available." Even the physical appearance of the neighborhood began to change. People started cleaning up empty lots, planting flowers, and fixing broken windows. It wasn't just about helping one person anymore, it had become about lifting up an entire community. As spring approached, Officer Chen stood outside her patrol car, watching children walk to school. But now, they weren't walking alone. Some rode the restored bus route, others walked in groups with community volunteers, and still others got rides from police officers who had learned to see beyond their badges. What had started as one act of kindness had grown into something that was changing the very fabric of their community. 1 year had passed since that freezing December morning when Officer Chen first gave Jasmine a ride to school. Now, on a bright spring afternoon, Jasmine sat in the precinct's study room, surrounded by textbooks and worksheets. The room, once a storage space for old files, had been transformed into a cheerful learning center where many students came to study after school. Jasmine's latest report card lay on the table in front of her, showing straight A's in all subjects. But it wasn't just her grades that had changed over the past year. The shy, struggling girl who once walked 3 miles to school in broken shoes had transformed into a confident young student who helped tutor younger children. "Guess what?" Jasmine announced as Officer Chen walked into the study room, still in her police uniform after her shift. "Mrs. Peterson says I can take advanced science classes next year. She thinks I might be able to get into the special medical program in high school." Officer Chen smiled proudly. She remembered how Jasmine had once whispered her dream of becoming a doctor, as if it was something impossible. Now she spoke about it with confidence, planning each step toward her goal. "That's wonderful news. Have you told your mom yet?" "She's coming here after her shift," Jasmine replied happily. Thanks to her new job as a restaurant manager, Teresa Williams now worked regular hours with better pay. She had even started taking evening business classes at the community college. The changes in Jasmine's life went beyond academics. Her worn-out clothes and broken shoes were replaced with proper winter gear donated by local businesses. But more importantly, she carried herself differently now. The weight of daily survival no longer pressed down on her young shoulders. Later that afternoon, other students filtered into the study room. Among them was Maria, a 9th grader who reminded Jasmine of herself a year ago. Without being asked, Jasmine moved over to help Maria with her math homework. Officer Chen watched from the doorway, remembering how Jasmine used to be too shy to speak to anyone. "You're really good at explaining things," Maria said to Jasmine. "I wish you could be my tutor all the time." "Maybe I could be," Jasmine replied thoughtfully. "Officer Chen, could I volunteer here more often, to help other kids like Maria?" Chen's heart swelled with pride. This was perhaps the biggest change in Jasmine, her desire to help others who struggled like she once did. "That's a wonderful idea. We could make you our official junior tutor." When Teresa arrived after her shift, she barely recognized the study room. The walls were covered with student artwork, college pennants, and motivational posters. A wall of achievement displayed photos of students who had improved their grades, with Jasmine's picture prominently featured. "Mom," Jasmine ran to hug her mother. "Look at my report card. And Mrs. Peterson says I can take advanced classes next year." Teresa's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her daughter's grades. Just a year ago, they had struggled to keep the lights on so Jasmine could study. Now, her daughter was flourishing, helping other students and moving steadily toward her dreams. "Officer Chen," Teresa said, turning to the police officer who had changed their lives, "I don't know how to thank you enough." "Your daughter did all the hard work," Chen replied honestly. "I just opened a door. She walked through it on her own strength." As they talked, more police officers stopped by the study room. They knew most of the students by name now, asking about their grades and families. The officers weren't just authority figures anymore, they were mentors, friends, and supporters. That evening, as Jasmine packed up her books, she paused to help a younger student organize his backpack. Officer Chen overheard her saying, "You know, it's okay to ask for help. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let others help us when we need it." Chen smiled, remembering the cold morning when a shivering girl had finally accepted a ride from a police officer. Now that same girl was passing on the lesson she had learned. That strength comes not just from enduring hardship, but from allowing others to help and then helping others in return. As Jasmine and her mother left the precinct, they walked past Chen's patrol car, the same one that had stopped on that life-changing December morning. But now, instead of walking 3 miles in the cold, they were heading to their car, a used but reliable vehicle Teresa had recently been able to buy. The sun was setting over Detroit's east side, casting long shadows across the precinct parking lot. But for Jasmine Williams, the future had never looked brighter. Her transformation wasn't just about better grades or warm clothes. It was about finding her voice, her confidence, and her place in a community that had learned to care. 5 years had passed since that freezing December morning. The main auditorium of the University of Michigan was packed with proud families and excited students. Among them sat Officer Sarah Chen, now a sergeant, wearing her dress uniform. Next to her was Teresa Williams, dabbing tears from her eyes with a tissue. They were both there to watch Jasmine Williams accept her full scholarship to the university's pre-med program. On stage, Jasmine stood tall at the podium, her voice clear and confident as she addressed the crowd as the student speaker. Gone was the shy girl with newspaper-stuffed shoes. In her place stood a poised young woman in a crisp blue dress, her high school valedictorian medal gleaming around her neck. 5 years ago, Jasmine began, I was a 12-year-old girl walking 3 miles to school in broken shoes. Today, I stand before you as proof that one person's kindness can change a life forever. She paused, looking directly at Officer Chen in the audience. A police officer saw me struggling and didn't just drive by. She stopped, she cared, and she showed me that sometimes our biggest obstacles become our greatest blessings. In the audience, several police officers from Detroit's East Side precinct listened proudly. They had all come to support Jasmine, wearing their dress uniforms. The mentoring program that started with one girl now helped hundreds of students across Detroit. But this story isn't just about me, Jasmine continued. It's about a community that learned to see each other as family. It's about police officers who became mentors, business owners who became supporters, and struggling students who became scholars. Teresa Williams squeezed Officer Chen's hand as they listened. Teresa now owned her own small restaurant, having worked her way up from waitressing. She employed single parents and offered flexible schedules, remembering her own struggles. Today, I'm not just accepting a scholarship, Jasmine said, her voice strong with emotion. I'm accepting a responsibility. When I become a doctor, I plan to return to Detroit's East Side. I want to open a clinic where children can get medical care regardless of their family's ability to pay. Because that's what Officer Chen taught me. When someone helps you climb a mountain, you build a path for others to follow. The applause thundered through the auditorium. In the back, Mrs. Johnson from the corner store wiped away tears. She had closed her shop for the day to be here, just as she had closed it years ago for Jasmine's high school graduation. After the ceremony, a group gathered in the university's garden. Officer Chen's mentoring program had grown into a citywide initiative. Other police departments had copied the model, creating similar programs in their cities. But more importantly, it had changed how communities viewed their police officers and how officers viewed their role in the community. Remember when you asked me why I became a police officer? Chen asked Jasmine as they took photos together. I told you it was to protect and serve, but you taught me what that really means. It's not just about enforcing laws, it's about lifting people up. Jasmine nodded, then pointed to a young girl standing nearby. That's Maria, the student I used to tutor. She just got accepted here too, pre-law program. She wants to become a civil rights attorney. Maria waved, her own scholarship letter clutched proudly in her hand. As the sun set over the university campus, casting a golden glow over the gathered crowd, Teresa Williams addressed the group. 5 years ago, I was working 2 jobs and could barely keep the lights on. Today, my daughter is going to become a doctor. She turned to Officer Chen. You didn't just help Jasmine that morning. You showed us all that poverty doesn't have to be the end of the story. Later, as people began leaving, Jasmine and Officer Chen walked through the campus together. They passed a police car parked near the entrance, and both smiled, remembering that first ride to school. You know what's funny? Jasmine said softly. That morning, I was so scared to get in your car. Now I can't imagine what my life would be like if you hadn't stopped. Chen looked at the young woman beside her, no longer a shivering girl in broken shoes, but a future doctor who would change other lives just as her own had been changed. Sometimes, she replied, the bravest thing we can do is accept help when it's offered. And the most important thing we can do is offer help when it's needed. As they walked back to join the others, both knew that this wasn't really the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, where a girl who once walked 3 miles to school in broken shoes would help others find their own path to success.